Hey everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian here with you, and this is the first video in probably a series of videos I'm going to do. I'm mostly going to be doing them in the movie room in the house where I live. The walls are all painted red. It's perfect to talk about crime, which will be the focus of a lot of these videos, but I'm bringing you this one in the early morning hours and everyone's asleep, so I'm in literally the front corner of the basement. I'm as far away from any bedrooms as I can be so that I can do this one. And this is my first one. I'm going to be doing a series of more story videos where it's just me coming to you. I'll have visuals to go with it whenever possible and whenever applicable. There's been a lot of interesting stories that have come to me through the grapevine over time since I've had a YouTube channel. And I've never done videos on them because I haven't been able to actually get to the place to visit. I've used that as justification for just not doing a video at all about it, which is just me being a fickle YouTuber. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm going to be almost lazy about it. And, even if Portland stories come up, I'm just going to kind of hang out on a wall and tell you the story and not actually go there. I'm still very invested and really love the dynamic of going to actual places where cases happen. But there's certain ones that are just too far away to get to. And that doesn't demean the nature of the story. And, I want these stories in particular not to demean the nature of murder, which a lot of these stories are going to be murder, crime stories that I talk about. Stories where human beings lost their lives and family members suffered, horrendous emotional impact from those tragedies. But that being said, I still want the stories that I tell to be interesting. And you scan through information and, you'll find a story where it's like, this guy killed this guy, was on the run for 2 days, got caught, they knew it was him, he got arrested, got convicted on the evidence, and that's the whole story. And, it's a very just cookie cutter, I don't know if that's the right terminology to use, but just a very simplistic case. And I want to talk about cases where the norm doesn't always apply. And for this one, I'm going back to February 1982.
Steve the Amateur Historian.
These stories are probably going to be from the 80s, because for those of you who don't know, the 80s, early 1980s were the worst time in America for violent crime in terms of just statistically. I know we think today, nowadays, is the worst time for violence, but every form of violent crime in America peaked between like 1981 and 1985, roughly. It's really actually astonishing that almost all forms of violent crime continue to slowly decrease over time, even though there's millions and millions of more people living in America than there were in the 80s, millions and millions of more people who could potentially be violent criminals. So yeah, a lot of these stories are going to be coming from the 80s, but this one really got my attention because of the strangeness of it all. And it started with a particular event that I don't want to start with because it makes everything too simple and linear. But there was an event that occurred that ultimately led to the police in the Beaverton neighborhood, which Beaverton is just west of Portland. It's one of the larger towns in Oregon. It's essentially a west suburb of Portland. But a pretty decent-sized city in its own right. And the police have reason to believe that there's a home in Beaverton that was ransacked by criminals who robbed the place in ski masks and took off. So the police arrive on the site. They're already suspicious, kind of, because there doesn't appear to be any forced entry. There's no signs of forced entry on the doors, on the windows, nothing. And it's the middle of the night, so it's very quiet. Everyone's asleep. They decide to ring the doorbell. I mean, they have reason to be concerned, so they ring the doorbell, and two children show up at the door. And when the police inquire, they say that they are the Elliott children, their parents. That was their parents' last name. The parents were, the wife was named Nonnie Elliott, and then the father was Tyro Elliott. Those were their names. And now again, the authorities who show up on the scene have reason to believe that this home has been ransacked, and here these two kids show up at the door, clearly, woken out of a sound sleep, which it's very interesting that these children would be going to answer a door in the middle of the night. But they have no clue. They don't know what the police are talking about when they say that their home was robbed or ransacked. They're like, we've just been asleep and haven't noticed anything. So the police, doing their due diligence, ask to come inside to search the home, to be safe. And they look around and they can see that the house is in a little bit of disarray. So it seems like their reason for being called out there wasn't completely pointless. And they start searching the rooms. While the children are presumably hanging out somewhere in the house. And they get to the master bedroom where their parents would sleep. And it is a bloody, gory, just disgusting mess. As it would be described, there's blood splatter everywhere. Massive pool of blood surrounding the body of Nonnie Elliott, the mother of the children. She had been beaten in the head with a blunt instrument of some kind and had been stabbed several times. So there started seeming to be some validity to the story that this place, not only now was this home robbed and ransacked, but obviously whoever did it murdered the mother. And, you almost want to breathe a sigh of relief that the children were okay. It seems they just slept through it. And, of course, the police moved the children away. They didn't want them walking in on that. So now they have a gross, violent homicide to deal with. And the twist to all this, what ultimately led the police to this house to discover this gruesome crime scene, is there's a trucker pulled off at a rest stop near Albany, Oregon, 70 or so miles south of Portland, the Beaverton area. And he's pulling out of the rest stop, and he's on in the lane to merge back onto the freeway. And as he's getting ready to do so, this man leaps in front of his semi-truck. He has to stop really abruptly before he hits him. And the guy's just waving him down. He's frantic. He's chaotic. And the trucker gets out of the car and approaches him, the man. And the man's like trying to communicate with him, but the trucker can't understand him. He can't tell if the guy has a speech impediment, if he's just in a state of shock over something, but he can't seem to understand what this guy's trying to say to him. And finally, the man that leaped out in front of his truck is able to communicate to him that he's deaf and mute. So he struggles to communicate verbally. But he manages to communicate to the trucker that he is Tyro Elliott, the husband of this woman who would later be found bludgeoned to death in their bedroom. And he conveys to this trucker that he had just escaped from a tree near the rest stop. He had, as he put it, he had gone to the store up in Beaverton, left his family at home, went to the store. He comes back, finds the house ransacked. And shortly after being in the house, suddenly these three men in ski masks come out. They're armed. They pretty much, you know, hold him hostage while they finish robbing the house. And then they make him, at gunpoint, get into his van that he drove. And they made him drive him down to this rest stop by Albany where he encountered this trucker. And it's there where they remove him from the van and they tie him up to a tree that he was able to escape. And then they took off, never to be seen again. So the trucker takes Elliott to the nearest police station so he can convey to them what happened. And once he tells authorities in Albany, you know, about this ransacking of his home and saying, oh no, and my family, I didn't see my wife or kids. Oh, now I'm worried about my family. So of course the local authorities up there get called, and that's how they ended up on this site. So you have this crazy story about this robbery, which in and of itself you can kind of understand. You know, it was a robbery gone wrong, or maybe these guys were more than just robbers. They were sadistic freaks, and one or all of them took part in brutally murdering this man's wife, who was also a deaf mute. They were a couple that were both deaf mutes, which is just such another strange aspect of this case. And now the case is almost immediately becoming one of these ones that it's like there doesn't seem to be a whole lot to go on. They actually did an autopsy on Nonnie Elliott and determined that she died of mechanical asphyxia, as it was described. And the way I saw it described, that essentially meant that the air passage was cut off in some way, so it's almost a form of strangulation or asphyxiation. And that was actually what she died from, because the police were trying to figure out whether it was the stab wounds that killed her or the blunt force trauma that she'd experienced. And as it turned out, it was something else altogether. So this was like a multifaceted murder, a very brutally violent one. And the authorities don't really have much to go on. They can't seem to figure out who these guys were. And these guys seem to have taken the husband, Tyro Elliott, out to this rest stop and then just abandoned him there, and who knows where they went. And one thing that really bothered the authorities, you know, they went around to all the neighbors and asked them, you know, what did you hear anything? What do you know about this family? And they described the Elliots as being, you know, very quiet and very to themselves, but, you know, a decent, normal family. Nobody noticed anything strange. But that's the thing, is nobody heard anything or saw anything suspicious the night that all this stuff is supposed to happen. They didn't see any other vehicle that these criminals may have been driving. They didn't see these men that were in ski masks. They didn't, there was no aftermath. They didn't see anything. Nobody saw anything. And even the children claim that they slept through all this. So it was a very, very strange scenario. And essentially they finally got Tyro Elliott back up to Beaverton, and they go over the story with him again, and suddenly details in his story start not matching up anymore. He'd kind of maintained the same story, and then details kind of started changing. The police conferred for a while, and then they arrested Tyro Elliott for the brutal murder of his wife. And yeah, what really kind of got my attention before I even knew that this was how this was going to end up was what made me think that this whole abduction thing was a ruse was, first of all, it doesn't really make any sense. They abduct this guy, they have him drive them like 70 miles away and then randomly stop at a rest area, and then they just tie him up and abandon him there. I mean, I understand you taking a hostage somewhere and putting him somewhere where he can't rat on you right away, but it just seems so strange that they would have him drive that. I mean, if you don't want this guy to rat on you, drive him out to the middle of nowhere. Don't drop him off at a rest stop where, even if it's the middle of the night, people are going to be showing up. And the authorities looked at the tree that Tyro claimed to have been tied up to, and they noticed that it was a really flimsy tree, a tree that anybody could have easily escaped from. So why would these guys pick that tree to tie him up if they were trying to buy time. By having him tied up, he can't get away. And apparently he had, Tyro had presented them a pair of like toy handcuffs, because they said they cuffed him to the tree. And I'm like, they used toy handcuffs to tie this guy up? Like, were these guys even trying? It just seems so ridiculous, this method that they tied him to a tree. But really, what really tied it up for me is they have him drive them to this rest stop, but they leave his van there. So they obviously had to have taken off in some other vehicle, but what other vehicle? They just had another vehicle sitting there at that particular rest stop. They had someone meeting him there. Why wouldn't they just drop him off and take his van? Yeah, he could report it stolen. I'm not saying they need to keep the van forever, but it doesn't make sense that they would leave the van there. And beyond that, if this guy gets free and can go, why does he run out in front of a truck and wave someone down to get their attention, to tell him what happened, so that he can then drive him to the police? If his van's right there in the parking lot, wouldn't he just run to his van and go straight to the police? You know, it doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense for him to do something like that to have a witness, to have someone who saw him frantic. Oh my God, I just broke free. You know, that trucker's a witness for him now, under the guise of a perfect story, but it ended up not being a perfect story. And Tyro Elliott ended up going on trial and being convicted for the murder of his wife. And it's very interesting. His defense attorney tried to claim that he suffered from this syndrome that's called Capgras syndrome, or Capgras, Capgras. And apparently when you suffer from this, it's usually, apparently it happens in people that are, you know, kind of sociopathic, completely out of their minds. And it's where you become convinced that people that are really close to you in your life are imposters, essentially. It's kind of an Inception thing, if you've seen the movie Inception, where Leonardo DiCaprio takes the love of his life into this Inception dream, and they end up in it so long that when they wake up, she's convinced that they're dreaming, even though it's reality. And she just can't accept the fact that they're back in reality and that the dream was the dream. It's kind of similar to that. Like, you just can't, no matter what they say, you're convinced that these people with you are an imposter. And that, I don't know, the article piece I read, it implied that the defense said that he had this, Tyro had this condition, but then it also suggests that his wife had it. So there's a little bit of confusion there, and I haven't been able to kind of find some common ground between that. I don't think they both had it, but I think the argument seems to be, the best argument that was being put forth was that Tyro had this, and in like a frantic moment where he was convinced that his real wife was a fraud, he violently murdered her. I mean, it sounds crazy, you know, just a crazy, you know, made-up wild defense to try to get your guy off, but, you know, here's this family where everything seems to be just fine, and this guy just suddenly hauls off one day and just violently, brutally murders his wife. But at the same time, that kind of presents the idea that this was impulsive, that he just suddenly did it, when it seems pretty clear that this was planned. I mean, he had this whole elaborate abduction thing set up, you know, that ultimately led to a specific rest stop with his van there, with a specific tree that he was tied to, and this story about 3 men in ski masks that, you know, ransacked his home and commandeered him. And it's still, I mean, when all is said and done, it's still astonishing. I mean, their children slept through this. They slept through their father's violent murder of their mother. You know, it was believed that it happened at about 10:30 p.m. at night, and then, you know, it was the early morning hours that he was found and the police went to their home. So, you know, maybe their kids were young enough that they were in bed by then, but I'm wondering, like, was his wife in bed, and did he kill her in her sleep? And so, you know, she didn't even have the opportunity to wake up. It just seems like this was, if he was able to commit a murder this brutal with no sound, she had to have been sleeping or incapacitated in some way. I don't know, but it's such a strange story. The idea of a deaf mute couple, and then one just brutally murdering the other and having this elaborate ruse to try to escape it, but it's such a poorly crafted one. Like, it was destined to fall apart at some point. But I mean, this is 1980s crime in Portland. I know I have a handful of stories from the 80s that are just wild and crazy. I have another one upcoming that I spent a long time trying to find information on that actually hits really close to home for me, and trust me, you'll know it when I put it up. And I finally just recently found the information that I needed on it because it was such an obscure case I couldn't find any information. So this is the first episode of me, bringing you these stories, and they're going to be mostly Oregon-focused stories, but I love people that do content like this, where they bring you these stories, and they're probably going to be stories that you don't know about. These fresh things, and it's like, oh my God, that's a crazy story. I would have never heard about that, because I live in Connecticut or New York or Tennessee or whatever. I'm bringing you these crazy Oregon crimes from back in the day. So anyway, this is something I definitely want to do a little bit more often, especially with my constrictions and time in my life, so on and so forth. That it's harder for me to go out and do as much, out in the world content, which I'm still going to be doing, but this just allows me to do more content that I really want to do that I didn't think I could do before, so it's a win-win. And with all that said, guys, you know the game. If you could, if you like me, like the video, share, subscribe, do whatever you can to help me out if you so desire, and hit up my Patreon. I have a Patreon page. If you want to help me financially, which any financial contributions help me to do more content, better content, the sky's the limit. So anyway, guys, thanks again for watching, and till next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian.